Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here. So welcome to this afternoon session on carbon dioxide removal, and really an opportunity to talk with you all and have a conversation. That's what we're going to be going for here. It's a living room conversation. And a little bit of background in terms of myself. So I'm Richard Corey. I'm a partner of AJW, a strategic energy transition consulting firm. Been there 6 months. The previous 37 years I was with California Resources Board, and about a third of that the director of the agency. And in a moment I'm going to introduce really our distinguished panelists, but want to provide a little bit of background for you all in terms of what we're hoping to accomplish in this conversation here. And really, it's really about an opportunity to talk about what's the state of carbon dioxide removal and really barriers, opportunities. Let's speak to some of the concerns that have been raised by some. Let's talk directly about it, where it's going. And I think the panel is really well positioned to answer these questions. Questions you have, and I'm going to be posing some questions to them as well. But I thought it'd be useful just to provide a little context. And I'm obviously going to use California's experience to set the stage, because I think the experience here is relevant to not just the state, but other states and jurisdictions across the globe. So if I think about back to AB 32 and the state back in 2006 establishing GHG reduction targets and a scoping plan that came 2008, which really set the stage for how is the state going to get back to 2020 emissions. And at the time, I remember, it was not possible, were some claims. Massive leakage, businesses would flee the state. Gas lines and a range of other problems were the claim when AB 32 was passed and as the scoping plan was developed. But as that plan really laid out, pretty comprehensive range of strategies that ultimately led to regulations, low carbon fuel standard, cap and trade, mobile source related measures, high GWP, HSC related measures, that sets a stage for investment, innovation, which ultimately is where reductions come from. Those investments and the associated innovation and the confidence the market has in terms of making those investments that delivered reductions. And if you fast forward to what happened, the 2020 GHG reduction target was met in the state 7 years ahead of schedule. The state progressively became a hub for innovation and clean energy investment, clearly in the transportation space, but many other spaces as well. Air quality benefits as well, as many of these policies didn't just reduce GHG emissions, they reduced other toxics and other criteria pollutant. And a lot of learnings from that innovation and the test bed in a way of cap and trade and low carbon fuel standard, which progressively played a larger role in the state and ultimately led to a number of partnerships across the country as well as with other jurisdictions. But as you guys all know, the science tells us that we need to go so much further. And when I say that, it's the collective. It's not just California, obviously. It's the nation. It's the globe. And those targets that I said were characterized as very difficult to meet were clearly not enough. Meeting our 2030, our 2045 carbon neutrality is going to take so much more. Investment, innovation, regulations, incentives, and using the most recent scoping plan, the 2022 California State Scoping Plan, which basically is a plan of how are we going to get to 48% reductions relative to 1990 by 2030? How are we going to get to carbon neutrality by 2045? That plan underscores it is all hands on deck. It is transportation, a full-on transition of the transportation to electrification everywhere possible, on-road, off-road. Significant improvements in rail, aviation, marine, the existing building stock, transition to electrification, commercial and residential stock, new builds, electrification requirements for all installs going forward, significant reductions in VMT, about a 95% reduction in petroleum use, production and use in the state, tracking along with this transition, significant reductions of methane and HFCs, which are going to require hundreds of billions of dollars of investments to support the infrastructure, to support this transition. And with all that said, this massive transformation, scoping plan was clear that we'd also need carbon dioxide removal to achieve carbon neutrality. It needed to be part of the mix. There was not a path forward to achieve carbon neutrality without having carbon dioxide removal in the mix, CCS, direct air capture, and so on. That is going to be a necessary element, and the necessary policy signals to be able to deliver on those results. And as a result of that, last year there was legislation in California, SB 905, that really followed from the intent of the legislature to establish a leadership position for California in the carbon dioxide removal space, directed, amongst other things, and on the panel we'll get in a little bit more detail on this than I'm going to, but among other things, establishing the California Air Resources Board to directing them to establish a carbon dioxide removal program, unified state permit process, additional assurances from a financial standpoint, really setting the stage, recognizing that to have a realistic expectation and strategy for moving forward and to achieve the state's ambitious goals, you couldn't pull strategies off the table. You need to keep a range in play and need to have the appropriate signals, market and otherwise, to support those investments, and honestly the process forward that enables projects to actually go forward and to go forward through a permitting process and so on. So with that, what I'd like to do is I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, really distinguished, but I'm not going to give them the recognition you all deserve. So I'm going to ask the panelists, after I do a brief introduction, to each introduce themselves. We'll go one by one and provide some background, because I think it's probably useful to do a little level setting here in terms of what is the state of play today, carbon dioxide removal, where are we today? And then during the course of our conversation, I have some questions I'm going to pose. You certainly can pose questions amongst yourselves, and then we'll have some time to hear from you all. So should be fun, should have a good time doing this. So let's see here, panelists. So to my immediate left, we have Coulson, really a leader in the engineering, carbon engineering space in the voluntary markets as well as marine and aviation. To her left, Nora Cohen Brown, a director of policy and market development with Charm Industry, active in the carbon dioxide removal, conversion, and storage space, amongst many other areas Nora will touch on. And then Virgil Welch, who actually have a long history with, served under 4 governors, California, and was the chief advisor to Chair Mary Nichols, who was the longstanding chair of the California Air Resources Board. So really experienced panelists, and really an opportunity to take advantage of this conversation. You have an amazing range of expertise here, and hopefully we can cut through myths, confusions, and really walk away with a much clearer understanding of where we are with carbon dioxide removal, where it's going, barriers, opportunities going forward. But with that, Cal, I was going to ask if you could give a little, expand a bit on my characterization of your background, and then kind of the state of play of carbon dioxide removal. Where are we today?
Let's see if this works. Perfect. So Richard gave me a great introduction. A little bit more about me. I'm an environmental engineer as my background, and I've spent about 15 years in government as well as industry on environmental policy and environmental compliance. And it set me up really, really well for my current role in carbon engineering, which I do international organization engagement, so I get to follow international policy for aviation, marine, as well as supporting work with UNFCCC Article 6 through AIDA, and also the voluntary carbon market, which is, the leader in some of these CDR spaces. So let me give a little intro to carbon engineering. I'm hoping the room is packed because we're very interesting panelists and you want to hear about us, but I'll level set who we are. So Carbon Engineering, we're a Canadian-based clean technologies company. We still think of ourselves as a startup, but we were actually founded in 2009 by Professor David Keith. And his mission was that he wanted to commercialize the technology of direct air capture at climate relevant scale. We are now 150 carbon engineers in Canada. And so what we focus on at Carbon Engineering is we really want to develop the technology to remove carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere. So once we remove that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, we can store it safely underground where it came from, or we can combine it with green hydrogen to make fuels that are drop-in compatible. And so our mission and vision from the beginning was to have this climate relevant scale infrastructure. And so let me tell you how we got there. In 2015, we commissioned our pilot plant in British Columbia. We ran that, learned from it, and then we built a scaled innovation center. And that scaled innovation center was commissioned in 2021. We ran great testing from that, iterated, got some data, and then designed our first commercial plant. We broke ground on our first commercial plant in 2022. And when that plant that's built by our partner 1.5 is complete, it will be capable of sequestering 1 megaton of CO2 every year. And so how did we scale so quickly? Because that's an incredible scale. And so Carbon Engineering looks at taking technologies from existing industries and then using them to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So we've borrowed from the cooling tower industry, we borrowed from the wastewater treatment industry and the calcination industry, and what we do is we try to knit this technology together to get efficiency and drive the cost down. So our innovation center in Squamish is meant as a test bed. We will build, learn, pull it apart, build it again, over and over, so that when we see that great cost curve on some of those places where you see direct air capture at a much higher price point come down, that is us working to try and drive that cost down. So I wanted to challenge the title of this a bit, because I feel like this might either be a bit dated or controversial. So Richard, I'm not sure if you chose the title.
I did not, so have at it, go for it.
But I feel like in a few years when I come back here, this would be something where it's just, here's the CDR industry maturing. And so I'll give a couple of comments about why I think that we should move past this towards just the CDR industry as it will be, at least with respect to direct air capture. So 4 points. The first is that, as Richard mentioned, the climate community has a great understanding of how much CDR is needed to meet our targets, and direct air capture plays a large portion of that. So we have the permission to move forward. We're no longer in that DAC is a future need, it is a now need, because we now need it to both meet our emissions, our climate goals, as well as historical emissions reduction. The second is the technology readiness. And so when I've looked at old reports that are even a few years old, the TRL on DAC is not where we are today. So we are deploying at commercial scale. Our partner, 1.5, which is a subsidiary of Oxy, has signaled that they want to build 130 plants, 1 megaton plants by 2035 with our technology. Our competitor, Climeworks, is already operational, and I like to use the word competitor because it's such a great space in direct air capture that we just want lots of competitors, lots of people in direct air capture to make this a mature industry. So the TRLs that you saw a few years ago in reports are now dated. The third piece is that, at least for direct air capture, we have a great set of existing regulations and GHG methodologies to be able, is that me? Can I squeeze in 2 more minutes? Is that my time?
No.
Oh, somebody's cutting me off.
Someone else's time.
Okay, so let me give a little bit of context for the last 2. So from a regulation and methodology development, we have great existing pieces. The California LCFS has a great methodology. The EPA has phenomenal regulations that we can build off of. And in addition to that, we've seen signals from the Canadian government that's developing a DAC protocol, as well as the BC government that is developing a direct air capture protocol. So we have these existing MRV, existing regulations that we're very comfortable moving into. In addition to that, we've seen movement in the voluntary carbon market, so both American Carbon Registry and Verra are working on methodologies that will quantify direct air capture this year. And the last piece, in terms of, oh, I've forgotten it. So that little piece has got me a little bit flustered, so give me 1 second, because I do want to land on it. Oh yes, how can I forget? The last piece of the recipe is that we've seen these two huge signals this last year in America. One is the IRA and the other is DAC hubs. So you now have these incentives that are taking this technology that people thought was a 2030s technology and becoming a 2020s technology. And so the recipe with those four things, I think that title in a few years will just be the mature CDR industry and not necessarily this savior or pipe dream. So not that we don't have challenges that we'll get into with Richard's questions later, but I would say we have a great recipe for a mature industry growing over the next decade.
Kel, thank you, and thanks for the challenge on the title. It's great. Nora.
So thank you so much for the introduction, and it's great to be here with you all today to talk about carbon removal. So I think carbon removal technologies are brand new, and I think a lot of you are probably wanting to know, are these things that we can do with high quality? I think Kel spoke to this a lot, and I'll share a little bit about my own background and also what we do at CHARM. So I run market development and policy at CHARM. I've been there for about a year, and a lot of my role is not just sort of the policy issues for CHARM, but also looking at the industry as a whole. And while there are a lot of great incentives for direct air capture, I would say that there's also a suite of other approaches to carbon removal that we still need to work together to find more policy venues for. And prior to this, I worked in ocean data collection, and I've always kind of worked at this intersection of technology and policy, and I spent about 6 years working in the federal government as well. At CHARM Industrial, we're really one of the leaders in the emerging CDR technologies. To date, we've permanently removed more carbon than any other permanent removal company, which is only about 6,000 tons. We hope that technologies in the US, so we hope that technologies like Kel's and other technologies in this space will soon surpass us in size. But the way that we do carbon removal is that we have mobile units that take waste biomass, so either forestry residues or corn stover that would otherwise rot or burn. They put it through a process called pyrolysis. And we can operate field side, which abstracts sort of we basically have a distributed model, and then we take the bio oil that we produce from that process, we inject it underground, and then we are able to then sequester it permanently because it hardens once it's beneath the Earth's surface. So this technology, again, we're currently injecting in Kansas. We are already removing carbon, and we're already doing a lot of work in the voluntary carbon removal with the removals that we have already confirmed and verified, and we're also doing a lot of work around how to verify those removals. What I'd say is that, while we are already doing this technology, already doing this in practice, there's a lot that needs to be done on the policy end to make sure that incentives and other things like that can support the growth of this industry. I think, again, I would also agree that I don't love the title of this panel as well, because I think that the answer is neither, right? This is like part of a suite of solutions, and I also think that if you look at the IPCC report that came out this week, there's no scenario that doesn't include carbon removal. So if we don't start to invest in technologies like ours and other similar technologies now, we will not get to the scale that we need by the time we need to remove megatons of carbon from the atmosphere.
Thanks, Nora. And Virgil.
Thank you, Richard, and it's unanimous. The title sucks, so we'll strive to do better. I'm Virgil Welch. I'm a partner at Caliber Strategies. We're an energy climate consulting firm, California-based company. I work with a lot of companies in the carbon removal, carbon capture space. I'm going to go fast because I know we've got a lot of questions and conversations to get to. I want to just make a couple of initial comments. One, we've come a really long way in California on this policy area in a pretty quick time. I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure this is, if not the first, one of the first forums at this venue to even contemplate this topic. As Richard said at the outset, 3 years ago, we didn't have much in the way of anything for a policy framework for carbon dioxide, carbon capture technologies. We now have protocols in the low carbon fuel standard, which, as Nora mentioned, need to be expanded to contemplate other technologies, but it's a start. We have a scoping plan that rightly identifies CDR as a necessary component of what it's going to take to achieve our climate goals. We've got now legislative direction, and I think the the Newsom administration deserved a lot of credit as well for taking a leadership role, particularly last year, to move forward the issue in California. But that ain't enough. We have to actually start seeing with a lot more purpose and pace projects across all these technologies come to fruition if they're going to make a real contribution to achieving the challenging emission reduction goals we've got. And that's going to require additional policy creation and modification, but it's also going to require a focus on implementation. So I guess the one thing I would underscore and will again and again today, we got to do the implementation if it's going to be a meaningful contributor in California. And so I think we need to be honest about how far we've come, but we've also got some challenges ahead of us in terms of bringing these really critical technologies into the fold at a scale that they can contribute.
Thanks, Virgil. And Kel and Nora touched on this, but I want to drill down a little bit more, particularly on the state of projects. In other words, are there commercial projects going in today? Where are they going in and why? Kel.
Well, like I mentioned in my intro, our first commercial plant will be being deployed in the Permian Basin. For us, direct air capture, we need to have good geological sequestration areas and as well as renewable energy. So in terms of where they're being deployed, we have some favorable conditions. If we're doing fuels, it's a little bit different. You don't necessarily need the geology subsurface to necessarily match. In terms of jurisdictions, the first are the US because it is so favorable. Some of the challenges that we have long term, when we think about direct air capture, a lot of folks don't have the concept of the scale. And so the scale for a direct air capture plant for carbon engineering that's 1 megaton is about 100 acres, and it's about $1 billion. And so when you think, and it's about 25 to 30-year life. So getting to FID on something like that is an incredibly challenging project. And so some of the challenges with even the great tax incentives, and Virgil mentioned what else is needed, you've got all these great policy implementations, but for direct air capture, your sole purpose is removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And so you've got these megaton billion-dollar facilities that are dependent on climate policy and carbon market revenue. And so those are the challenges for future deployment. So right now we do have our partner with 1.5, that's a subsidiary of Occidental. FID on their first plant was an in-house FID. But how do we get to deployment where we have partners that don't have the scale of the oil and gas industry? How can we get other projects up that are able to close the business case with the policies that are there? So we have good environment in certain elements right now, but we need to replicate those in other jurisdictions, and we need to continue to support them where they do work.
Thank you. Nora?
Yeah, so on our end, we almost have the opposite approach in that we have much smaller units, so we're able to deploy pretty quickly. So last year, we deployed our first, we're aiming for like a 10-ton per day throughput of biomass for our operational unit. And so we deployed a first pilot version of that unit in Kansas last year for 6 months to do testing and kind of get to the next iteration of the pyrolyzer. We're also, at the same time, using pyrolyzers that are designed by other companies to help start getting the operational, we're trying to operate 24 hours a day, so we're already trying to basically demystify that process and also remove as much carbon as quickly as possible by running those units. And right now those run in Colorado. We're also doing a pilot or potentially 2 pilots in California this year with forestry residues to help with vegetation management and wildfire fuel reduction. And then we also have third-party bio-oil that's a waste product for some other industrial processes where we measure the carbon content and we inject it already in Kansas. So we're not at full commercial scale. The aim is to start, producing a lot more pyrolyzers a year in our factory in San Francisco within the next, about 5 years. But we are also already deploying and operational in the field, and we're already selling tonnage on the voluntary market. One other thing I'll say is that our parallel R&D path with our bio-oil is also to steam reform that bio-oil to convert it into a syngas that can be used for steel production. That's a much longer R&D path. Right now we're at like 1/1000th of the scale we'd need to be to actually, operate in a steel plant. But that's the long-term goal for the bio-oils, to help with an extremely hard to decarbonize industry, as well as doing carbon removal.
Thanks, Nora. Anything you'd like to add, Virgil?
I would just say that in the sort of traditional, in the CCS realm, just in California, there's like 75 plus, sources across multiple economic sectors that are potentially, suitable with the, correct economic incentives and the policy framework and permitting and stuff like that. So like there's a whole bunch of potential applications right now. It's really a question of how do you create the right incentives for folks to take the steps to actually go and start capturing emissions.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to start with you, Virgil, at the other end of this one, kind of the elephant in the room, and that is, I've heard for years, and even as recently as walking around this conference, the assertion, and many times I think people are talking about EOR, but they don't necessarily say that. It's carbon dioxide removal, extends the life of oil, has safety-related issues. How do you respond to that?
Well, as it relates to California, EOR is off the table with CO2, pursuant to law that went into effect this year. But on the broader question, which I think is really what you're getting at, I mean, I would posit that the purpose here is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with, scientifically derived targets on schedules and timeframes that, the experts have told us we need to meet. And that, we shouldn't be ruling out any technologies that can potentially do that. I mean, we talk a good game in California about being technology neutral, and we always have, certainly in the regulatory space. But frankly, sometimes we decide which our favorite ones are, and we kind of push in that direction. And I think this is an instance where we have to be really careful if there are, benefits that we can account for from technologies that are associated with CCS on, in the oil and gas sector, we should be, using those as part of the equation as well. And the last point I would make on this is, and, I didn't say this at the outset, but it's pretty cool to have a moderator who's, responsible for many of the path-breaking climate policies that California's adopted over the last 15 years. And as you know, Richard, part of that has been working on this transition away from fossil fuel. And so that is ongoing. It's not like these two things are at odds with each other, because as you well know, California is in fact working, as the latest scoping plan articulates, on what the future looks like, increasingly less and less reliant on fossil.
Thanks, Virgil, and well stated on multiple accounts. Nora, same question, really interested.
Yeah, I would answer not just from my perspective at CHARM, but also, as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm doing a lot of work across the kind of very nascent carbon removal industry, and I'd say that one of the guiding principles there is that the work that we're doing is fully dedicated only to removing carbon from the atmosphere and really looking at legacy emissions and, ways to take emissions that have already been emitted out of the atmosphere, and that's kind of completely separate from any types of industry that are polluters. And I think that it's really, we're at this point where the biggest priority is always to transition. That is where most of our efforts should go. But I think that there's a lot of technology developers and innovators that have seen that, I think that's like literally a reaction to the IPCC report that identified that gap that carbon removal has to fill, where people are trying to figure out, well, how do we innovate our way out of this, and how do we scale new solutions to help fill in that gap for hard to decarbonize industries and other areas where it's just really difficult to figure out how we're going to possibly decarbonize quickly enough. So I would say that I think that it's one of the struggles we have in this new industry is sort of distinguishing that from I think we need all of it, right? We have to figure out any way that we're going to reduce emissions, but I think that from the carbon removal industry standpoint, what we're looking at is really how do we take care of legacy emissions and how do we really just have a climate impact?
Thank you. Kel?
So I'll start with saying that carbon engineering is really agnostic because what our focus is taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and we rely, and we're a technology provider, and so we look for our plant developers that might have very different use cases. So I won't weigh in on our position on EOR, but I can give you a couple of pieces that I learned while I was at Carbon Engineering that maybe changed my view about where EOR might sit. And so I didn't know, and I don't know how widespread this is. I didn't realize that EOR took CO2 from domes that existed and piped it down. So one of the original reasons that people were interested in carbon engineering was that these domes that are underground were depleting. And so it was like, where can we get more CO2? Oh, we'll pull it out of the atmosphere. And so there was a conversation before I got to carbon engineering just in the industry to say, if we're running out of CO2 and we need to find it because we like this operation, we're going to pull it out of the atmosphere. So a lot of the incentive for the technology would have been that the people who were looking at buying it were using it for a known commodity of CO2. What we've seen as the industry has developed and as all the items that we've talked about in climate science is that the buyers that we've had, or the early commitments to buy our removals, all want to have non-EOR and they want them in saline aquifers. And so the signal from the market right now is not to have them in oil fields. So Occidental Petroleum, who is our global deployment partner, secured King Ranch, which is also in Texas. I'm not quite sure where, but it's named after King Ranch truck, which I learned as well. But that's looking at 30 megatons of non-EOR. So there's a response, especially with the IRA, signaling the different price, 45Q on the different price point to say, we want to see the incentive not for EOR. So I think for carbon engineering, we will respond to the market. We want to see the technology move quickly. We want to see it iterate down and become more efficient. And we will respond to the market on where that sits and continuously learn from the science on where the best use of CO2 is.
Thanks, Kellen. Kind of following on the economics, thinking about, and I get that there are different, clearly, types of projects, but thinking about, the question really is there a carbon price point that really makes projects economic? And the follow-on is how important are the federal incentives as well as the low carbon fuel standard for projects to identify, basically to move forward, break ground and move forward. Kel.
Oh, I get to start. So it is so important to be able to have policy, a large amount of policies, because what we saw, the first one was California. I think it's I'm not a California expert, 30 megaton cap, I believe. And one of the great pieces about the California LCFS is that direct air capture is actually a pathway within the LCFS. So California recognized that this is a great incentive. And so in terms of what we need to see from an economic standpoint is having more markets to be able to signal to the investors that it's not just California, that these other markets will come online, would help from a cost and price perspective. Having it in an LCFS often gives it a little bit more value than, say, a traditional offset, which is hard to compete. You don't want direct air capture to compete directly against offsets. Removals should be treated in their own way. In terms of price point, I don't know if I have a carbon price that is the silver bullet or the savior that will help us, but it's really that combination of different policies that will allow the industry to just scale up, and then hopefully as we scale up, the price comes down to a point that it's easy to include in compliance systems, it's easy to include in LCFS, and it's not this sticker shock of price. As a technology provider, we don't talk about pricing because each one of our plant developers is going to have a different price model. Some of our plant developers in Europe are working with European energy, and so obviously their price points are different. There is some really detailed pricing within Occidental's third quarter earnings. And anybody who's interested, drop me a business card. I'll send you the link. But it's slide 8 and slide 44. There's detailed analysis on how policy overlays with that, and there's some pricing. So I'll leave that as the comment on price.
Thanks, Cal. Nora, same question on economics.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a wide range of pricing for a lot of these nascent technologies, and I mean, we're very transparent about our pricing. We currently sell at $600 a ton. That's obviously not a price that a market can bear for the long term, right? But for us, it's because we're building pyrolyzers with engineers in San Francisco. We are not mass producing them at this point. We don't have the full operation scaled up as we are learning how to actually bring this to scale. So I think that's common across the industry, and I think that we're, I think the signal from some of the major voluntary market players that they're willing to buy carbon removal at a very high price in order to help bring down those cost curves has spurred a large industry of innovation, and I think that that's exactly what's needed. I think, our hope is to get down a lot of the equipment that we use for our pyrolyzers is nothing particularly bespoke or expensive. So once we get to mass production, we hope to get closer, much farther down that cost curve to something in the, $50 to $200 a ton or even lower. But what I'd say is that the incentives are really critical, not just because of the actual dollar amounts of the incentives and things like tax credits, but also because of the signal to the market. And I think that there also just in a market like this, there has to be government involvement because this is such a new field. There are a lot of questions around quality and making sure that these removals are permanent and that they meet certain standards. And I think that the government's going to have a role to play here, both at the state and federal level for a long time.
Thanks, Nora. Virgil.
I agree with everything that they just said. I don't really have anything to add. I did want to just say that dude right there, though, is the reason that there's a signal in the LCFS for carbon capture and CDR technologies in the first place. Seriously.
We have celebrities among us. This is exciting.
And the only other point I would make is, despite the tremendous work that Sam did, the regulatory signals and incentives need to be expanded to incorporate other technologies, and they need to be, frankly, optimized and refined, because the current way that those signals manifest themselves is very challenging and can be, frankly, a deal breaker for lots of folks who otherwise, are ready to go, or at least start moving more quickly.
Thanks, Virgil. I'm going to circle back to that point in just a minute because I think it's a really important one. But back to you, Virgil, in terms of, is there a gold standard in terms of protocols for projects moving forward?
Well, I mean, it was alluded to already. I'm biased, obviously. I think the work that, California has done in a regulatory context, not just on this topic, but on everything from transportation to, building market-based programs, has often been recognized as the gold standard. And there's a balance there, frankly, in my opinion, between the requisite level of rigor and accountability and MRV and all that stuff, but also not going so far as for it to be an impediment for, these kinds of technologies. And so, to me, the gold standard is figuring out kind of how to get that balance right. Yes, we have to absolutely demand, that we can't have another CDM situation, for example. But I think we can also do this in a way that it's a little more sort of optimized and streamlined.
Thanks. Nora, anything to add on this?
Yeah, I would agree with what Virgil said, and I think that especially in the carbon removal space, this is also new. There's a lot of work happening right now and a lot of discussion around how measurement and reporting and verification should take place. At CHARM, we did the legwork very early to start really looking at our life cycle analysis and everything that should go into a measurement and reporting and verification framework. We've published a white paper that's on our website, and we also publicly share the life cycle analysis for every removal that we do, and we plan to soon work with a third-party verifier on that as well. But I think what's challenging is that these are all new technologies that have new approaches, and there isn't a ton of knowledge about how to measure them well and what this should look like at scale, because it's really different than some of the existing technologies. And so I think it's very important that that side of the market figures out how to scale as well and how to address this new section of technology, but also the incentive structure, I think, is important there as well, because I think that, again, because there's a lot of questions about it, it's really important that there be a lot of clear work and quality control that goes into it, and some guidance, I think, from regulatory bodies as well.
Thanks, Nora. Kel?
So I mentioned in the beginning that we're, from a direct air capture standpoint perspective, think that there's some, California we point to globally as the standard for methodology. I do think there's challenges with jurisdictions that don't have a regulatory framework like the EPA does that you can kind of flange against and leverage. As somebody who used to do protocol development at Government of Canada, and just shout out to Eva, Patrick, and if Nate's here, we were helping to get that federal program off the ground. I learned a lot about protocol development and the fact that you had mentioned at the beginning, getting it perfect is not all, you need to just get it off the ground. And so you write the protocols you're going to learn from the MRV. And so I think, at least from this industry, we are engaged directly with people who are writing this to try and give them all of the information that they need, with the information that we have still being pre-commercial. So we're currently working with those two registries in the voluntary system. We have somebody from Carbon Engineering sitting on the technical expert panel for Canada's standard, and so we're hoping to just work lockstep so that we can iterate those protocols more quickly. I would make a comment, because there's a lot of people from the voluntary carbon market here. One of the challenges that we've seen in the voluntary carbon market is just the traditional program frameworks don't always really have the capacity to take some of these projects. And so 2 examples. One is that the life cycle assessment, which you mentioned, is so important. These technologies have to have this full cost life cycle assessment in order to have the integrity to be able to charge the price point of the technologies that are more expensive, and also have confidence that these are being accounted for appropriately. And some of the boundary conditions of traditional projects aren't taking into account for us. We need the upstream energy associated with that counted in order to ensure that there's a full life cycle assessment. And some methodologies some programs don't necessarily have that as in their vision of, here's the project, you're going to build it, and we're like, well, we also need you to add this additional emissions so that it showcases the entire life cycle assessment. So we're, as an industry, saying, please add more sources to, even though it would be less credits for us, it is higher integrity. And then the other piece is just, our technology requires a lot of energy, and so programs need the flexibility to potentially look at whether it's purchase power agreements, green purchase power agreements, but how do you take these new giant, climate relevant infrastructure and then bring them into traditional voluntary carbon markets that maybe haven't considered things of this scale. So.
Thanks, Kel. And I go back to you, Kel, on this one, and that is, can you help just walk us through the process in terms of what's involved in site selection, permitting, getting a project in place, kind of just a walk through the scope and the time that it actually takes for that to play out?
I can touch on this, but I would also start with saying what we've done from Carbon Engineering is, as the technology provider, we've kept our North Star as iterating our technology. And so one of the things that we had to decide early on, and I'll compare it to our largest known competitor, Climeworks. Climeworks is both a technology development and they're a plant developer. So they are like an integrated package. For us, we've decided to focus on the technology deployment, and then we look for partners that are able to execute these large projects. And so Carbon Engineering doesn't have the in-house, we didn't want to scale our in-house expertise to include permitting, to include site selection, because these weren't core competencies that we wanted to have our 150 carbon engineers working on. So our 150 carbon engineers are working on getting that packing right, getting our solvents right, how do we get more efficient, where do we need to add heat, where do we need to remove heat, and that's what carbon engineers work on. When we have partners that are looking at being able to deploy this, they're proven companies, and we have kind of a standard for who we take on as plant developers, but they're companies who have proven that they can do these large-scale projects on time, on cost. They have permitting experts. But I will give like a flavor for what we've seen with Direct Air Capture 1, what we call DAC 1. And so I had mentioned at the beginning, we did our innovation center in 2021. We ended up getting to design in 2022, which was a fairly quick turnaround. So now we have a design above ground. everything that our partners are going to do are outside the battery limits. So they're looking at utilities, they're looking at permitting, they're looking at roads, they're looking at subsurface, and our first commercial plant broke ground in 2022, and we expect it to be online late 2024. So that's about the timeline that we have for that project, and there's been a ton of conversation about permitting. I think there's an opportunity within this sector to be able to expedite or figure out how we can do permitting when we're talking about doing a lot of plants. But so long story short, it's quick but not fast enough. And we also look for people who have this expertise so that we can focus on exactly what we need, and then they can focus on deploying the projects.
Thanks, Cal. Nora.
Yeah, we are in, because we're a distributed type of project, we kind of have a different, because we're not looking for permanent sites. That said, I think that it is permitting is one of the major areas, and I'd say particularly in California, for instance, when we look at underground injection, we use class 1 and class 5 wells and caverns. So those are already existing well types. However, permitting them for something new like what we're doing could take between 5 and 10 years, right? So I think that we are more choosing locations based on where we have the ability. I think for us it took about maybe 6 months for us to be able to get permitted in Kansas to do injections. What I'd say we're also looking at scale is air quality permitting and what that looks like for mobile units, which again is sort of not how the permitting structure is set up. So I think that my overall comment on this is I think that's as this variety of technologies gets to a larger deployment phase, there's going to have to be a lot of attention on how to fast track permitting or how to make sure that we're still keeping all of the environmental safeguards in place that are critical for these types of projects, but also knowing that these are projects that are literally meant to help with air pollution and things like that, figuring out how do you actually get them going faster than a decade, because we don't really have a decade to wait for deployment.
Well stated. Virgil.
It's too long.
Pointed. I'm going to go back to you, Virgil, because it really builds on this same point, because we've talked about California, we've talked about California leadership, but if I look around, I don't think I'm going to find any projects today. Why is that? What needs to happen specifically? What actions and steps need to play out going forward?
I'm actually relatively optimistic that we're going to start seeing some, even in California, where for folks who aren't from or have experience working in California, we do a great job on the policy front. Seriously, a global leader, but when it comes to the implementation, project deployment, California is really challenging. And so the good news is I think there's an increasing recognition among key decision makers in the last couple of years that goal setting is not enough and that implementation is fundamental to success, and that's starting to be a material component of the conversations that are happening in the policy-making world at regulatory agencies. Last year, I'll use as an example to illustrate, there was some progress made on permitting for certain kinds of clean energy projects to create a streamlining approach, not, ignoring all the critical criteria we need to be adhering to with respect to impacts, across the environmental media, but definitely moving it along more quickly. I think that's starting to move into the dialogue more effectively in the CER world, but we're not there yet, honestly. And one of the exciting things is that CARB now has direction to come up with basically a framework that will be used to move projects more quickly through the permitting process. So maybe it's a glass half full kind of message, but I think we can potentially fill the rest of that glass up if we do that part right over the next, months and years, but it has to be soon.
Sounds right. Ambition is difficult, but execution much, much harder. Nora, anything you want to add to this one?
I don't think I have anything
Okay.
more to add.
All good. I'm going to leave a little bit of time for wrap up if there are any closing remarks that you have, but I want to see if anyone in the audience had questions for our panelists in the back. You could stand up and just project.
Hi, my name is Rob Alloway. Slightly hard question, if that's all right. 1 gigaton a year per plant. I think that's about half a megawatt of electrical power, 24/7, 400 tons of water. We can remove carbon from the air, but should we? There's too much of it, but not enough, 0.04%. Is this a good use of electricity? You need to have truly surplus renewable power, otherwise you're just pushing emissions somewhere else. Is this a worthwhile focus for technology, effort, those 150 people, all that electricity, all that water? Or should we be making hydrogen? Should we be storing the spare electrical power and using it to replace fossil fuels rather than having emissions elsewhere and then sucking back out?
I think is that at me? So great questions, and I will point to folks that are beyond carbon engineering for really solid answers on that, because I'm going to answer incredibly biased that I do think it's very important to do. I think it has to be done thoughtfully, and I think it has to be done in concert with everything else. So some of the benefits of carbon engineering that I can think about from a deployment perspective on electricity is that we're really seeing that we have had inquiries where there are places that want to do renewable energy deployment that don't have a base load. So we actually could provide the base load for more dispersed communities to have renewable energy. In terms of where the electrons go, I think you have to have really good guardrails on your development to ensure that you're not cannibalizing from existing electrical grids that have green energy. But in terms of should we be doing it, I think we should. And there's a lot of benefit to it from a CDR perspective. We don't take up as much land as forestry, and so at some point, it's if you can concentrate the CDR in places that have high renewable energy potential, then you allow for more of the land to be rewilded. And so that's kind of one of the things that we think about is these facilities can be located in quite arid places. They have a small relative footprint to an offset project, and we could potentially use renewable energy and increase the capacity of renewable energy. So it might not be the answer you're looking for, but you're asking a very biased source, so that will be my answer to this.
I mean, I would just add briefly, first of all, it's an absolutely valid question that should be asked with regard to any technology. I think it fundamentally gets back to being able to account for the life cycle impacts of whatever it is that we're doing. And if it's a carbon benefit, then we should be thinking about it being included on the table. And if there are better alternatives, then we should be, evaluating those. But to me, that's a question that is applicable, across the realm of whatever we're doing, whether it's in the transportation sector, the carbon removal sector, the power sector, or whatever.
I'll add a quip that I think it's a better use of electricity than crypto.
Nora.
I'll just add that from our perspective, we have a very different footprint. We don't use that much power at all, and we're able to, because we take advantage of the natural process of photosynthesis to capture the carbon, it means that we don't actually have a lot of energy that goes into the process, which is part of why we chose this route, because we think it could be not very impactful, plus we have the additional co-benefits of being able to help with forestry fuel reduction programs and also help with completing abandoned and leaking wells. So I think that it's not I think it's a project, as Virgil said, or a question that needs to be asked of every project, and I think it is incredibly important. I think what I'll say for those of us that are in the carbon removal industry, we're not here because we think that renewables shouldn't happen. We're here because we think it's not going to happen fast enough, or that the energy transition is not going to happen fast enough, so that there needs to be more on the table and more options that can be scaled as needed. But I think that it's also very important to look at every aspect of that life cycle analysis to make sure that it's worth it and that it's not taking away from other worthy projects.
Thank you. And I want to really encourage you guys to ask really hard questions because I don't have to answer them. These guys get to. Go ahead.
So I have a question about how you're funding your scale, right? I'm assuming there's a gap between the early stage, whether it's an
is that for, sorry, me or
Both of you guys.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think we're at an early enough stage that we're primarily venture-backed, but I think that a lot of the incentives that you see in the federal government, I think, are meant to help fill some of those gaps. I think that there will be, there will be challenges for some projects as they scale. Again, we have a different scaling path because we're a distributed, source of carbon removal, but I think that the voluntary market and the Fortune 500 companies also have to buy carbon removal, and there has to be incentive from the government for them to do that, for this market to actually work, though, too. So I think that there is, I think there are programs that there's a lot of discussion of government programs to help with scale demonstrations and other larger programs to help kind of get from that like nascent innovation stage to a larger project financing stage. But I think we're kind of in the wild, wild west right now of this market. So I think that there's also a lot still to come on how that works.
So I would echo that there's a lot to come on how that will work. I know that we're looking for optionality when it comes to project financing, and I don't have a project finance background, so I might be using this lexicon wrong. But what I think about is that we need a lot of policies that allow for direct air capture in them in order to give the market confidence. We also need reliable offtake. And so if you've got a plant that's functioning for 25 years, we have some great initial commitments. Airbus has pre-committed to 400,000 tons, but that is half of one plant for half of 1 year. So we need the permission in the voluntary market and then eventually into compliance markets to give us the resiliency that, hopefully we don't go backwards on policy, but we know that can happen. And so having a lot of different options for compliance and voluntary markets helps add resiliency. And then I think the creative government measures, I know in Europe, looking at contract for difference, the support that's happened on the tax breaks in America. And so it's just each jurisdiction is getting very creative and helping support the technologies that they want to scale. And then there's this, if you build it, they will come. We're hoping by 2035, you've got these great markets that are functioning, and you've got great net zero targets that are the uptake on our targets, on our credits.
Thank you. Time for one more question. Right there.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess a couple of things. First of all, the way that we've looked at our measurement, reporting, and verification and how we actually count our carbon removal is very conservative. We do believe that there'll be a lot of methane avoidance and also a lot of benefit in terms of the fact that we also have a biochar byproduct, and we don't account for that carbon removal as part of our protocols because we think that the bio oil is where the primary carbon removal lies. But the way that it is carbon removal is that basically, plants are absorbing carbon and we're breaking the carbon cycle by converting them into another product that stores the carbon permanently instead of letting any of that carbon escape or the methane, right? But we're actually not accounting for the methane as part of the way that we look at the full climate impact. It's more of a co-benefit that we see as part of the process. Does that make sense? But I will also take the point that I think it's something, on the one hand, what we do is sort of simple, but on the other hand, it's very hard to explain. And so I think it's also part of the overall, there's a large communications challenge for the CDR community about how to make it more digestible, like what we do.
I would just, and I guess kind of to your point, sir, there are also air quality benefits here as well for a lot of, in this case, what is otherwise going to go up in flames in the Central Valley where we have, many communities who experience some of the worst air pollution in the country.
Thank you. And Nora, your response was so good. I heard the applause back there, so it was impressive. So we're going to wrap up here. And I had not prepared this question, but just thinking about the conversation, I'm going to ask each of you for a prediction. and you can make a few brief comments as we close, and then we're going to wrap up. Prediction on the scoping plan, the 2022 California scoping plan that we were talking about calls for in terms of achievement of the 2030 GHG reduction target as well as 2045 carbon neutrality, a 20 million metric ton of carbon dioxide removal 2030, 100 million 2045. Virgil, is that going to happen?
I think it can happen, and I underscore can, and I would be a broken record here and reiterate, if we continue to have the right policy, regulatory mechanisms in place in the time that we need. And time is running pretty short, frankly, particularly when you look at 2030. I mean, as you know, 2006 to 2020 happened pretty damn fast, you know, and now we're looking at basically the same time frame from here to carbon neutrality, and that's so like we got to move.
On point, Nora.
I mean, I live in the world of innovation and I work at a startup, so it's our job to believe that we can get there. And there's a lot of really, really smart people and a lot of capital that's working to try to make it so. That said, I agree, there's a lot that has to fall into place for, you know, the pace of scaling that this industry needs to do is insane, right? It is faster, like, you know, 3 times faster than the software industry scaled, right? It is really, it is a unique challenge, and we're in a unique moment where we just have to figure out how to make it work. I think that also there has to be the market signals, there has to be regulatory, you know, frameworks in place, and, you know, we have to start trying out these technologies as soon as possible so that we actually have the ability to scale them by the time that that level of removal is needed.
Thank you, and Kel.
So I would say yes and yes to this, and I would agree with Nora that in a startup you just have to believe that you're going to do it, even though we're getting too big to call ourselves a startup. But I would also say that there's it feels like such a watershed moment in the last year that I think it's the next 18 months that are really going to be so important to see how we end up with all of these, how the policies get operationalized and how we start doing plan deployment. But I feel like it's so exciting, and I'm just so hopeful that we're going to get over this crest and then it just becomes boring. And I want to say this because direct air capture went from being science fiction to we're going to build it, and now why aren't you building it fast enough? And so I, as an environmental engineer, hope that in 50 years it's just a utility like everything else we use for air pollution control. It's just in a textbook. I hated air pollution control. It was the worst course. There's too much modeling. But it will just be direct air capture, and there will just be plants humming in the background that are kind of the backstop abatement for what we need, and it becomes a boring, unsexy industry. So that's my hope and vision.
Excellent. Well, panelists, really good conversation. I think we had some fun as part of it, and thank you to all of you, and let's hear it for our panelists.